The glass shattered before anyone even saw her hand shake. Alina Whitfield stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, a servant's tray of champagne broken at her feet, and 300 pairs of eyes turning toward the sound. She had not meant to knock it over. She had meant to escape through the side door before anyone noticed she had come to the wrong ball, wearing the wrong dress, carrying a debt she could not pay, and a family name that meant nothing in this room full of silk and diamonds. A hand caught her elbow before she could fall into the mess of broken crystal. "Steady," a low voice said. "The floor is not going anywhere. Neither, it seems, are you." She looked up and understood with a sinking feeling exactly who was holding her arm. The Duke of Ashcombe. Every unmarried woman in London had spent the last 3 weeks memorizing his face from a distance, and here she was, inches from it, smelling faintly of spilled champagne and humiliation. "I am fine," she said, pulling her arm free. "You can let go now." He blinked. Nobody said that to him, not in this room, not in any room he had walked into for the last 11 years. "You are bleeding," he said, nodding at her hand. She looked down. A small cut, barely anything, a thin red line where a piece of glass had nicked her palm. She pressed her other hand over it and did not answer him. Around them, the orchestra had not stopped playing, but half the guests had. Whispers moved through the crowd like a draft under a door. "I need a cloth," the Duke said to no one in particular, and a servant appeared instantly with a folded handkerchief. He held it out to her. Alina took it, wrapped it around her palm, and turned to leave. "You did not answer me," he said. "You did not ask a question. I asked if you were fine. And I told you I was." She walked away from him without another word, weaving through the crowd toward the terrace doors, leaving the Duke of Ashcombe standing over a puddle of spilled champagne with a look on his face that his closest friends would not have recognized. It was not annoyance. It was not even curiosity. It was something closer to being woken up. Alina found the terrace empty except for the cold night air and the sound of her own heartbeat. She leaned against the stone railing and let herself breathe for the first time in an hour. Her aunt would be furious. Her aunt had spent good money, money they did not have, on this dress, on this evening, on the idea that somewhere in that glittering room was a man who might solve every problem waiting for them at home. She had not come here for a husband. She had come because her aunt had threatened to lock her out of the house if she refused, and because refusing anything else her aunt asked would only make the coming months harder than they already were. Her father's small parish had never paid well, and after his death, the small amount of money he left had gone quickly, quietly, the way money always seemed to disappear when a family needed it most. She was still standing there, arms wrapped around herself, when the terrace doors opened again. "You left before I could apologize," the Duke said. She did not turn around. "For what? You did not spill the tray." "For starring. I imagine it was uncomfortable, being stared at by half of London while bleeding on their floor." Despite herself, the corner of her mouth twitched. "It was not my finest entrance." "I have seen finer," he admitted, stepping up beside her at the railing, careful to leave space between them. "I have also seen far worse. Lord Pembroke fell into the fountain last season trying to bow to the Dowager Countess. He has not lived it down since." "Is that meant to make me feel better?" "It is meant to make you laugh. Is it working?" She glanced at him sideways. He did not look like a man who told jokes. He looked like a man who owned half the county and knew it, the kind of face carved for portraits rather than conversation. But there was something almost hopeful in the way he was watching her, waiting to see if the joke had landed, and it struck her as strange. Men like him did not usually need to try this hard. "A little," she admitted. "Good, then I have accomplished more tonight than I expected to." "What did you expect to accomplish?" "Survival," he said simply. "These evenings are rarely more than that." She studied him properly then, for the first time since he had caught her arm. He was younger than she expected, up close, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of good tailoring could hide. Whatever he was surviving, it was not boredom alone. "You could simply not come," she said. "I could, but then my aunt would come instead, and she is far more difficult to escape than a room full of strangers." "I understand that particular problem." "I imagine you do." He nodded toward the ballroom behind them, where the music had shifted into something slower. "Is that why you are hiding out here? An aunt with plans of her own?" Aliner's jaw tightened just slightly, but enough that he noticed. "I am not hiding. I am getting air." "Of course," he said, and did not press further, which surprised her more than if he had. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that should have been awkward and somehow was not. Below them, in the garden, a pair of lanterns swayed on a low branch, throwing soft light over the gravel path. "I do not know your name," he said eventually. "I did not offer it." "No, you did not." He said it without any irritation, almost like he found it interesting rather than rude. "Most people offer it before I even ask." "Most people want something from you." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she expected him to bristle, to remind her, quietly or otherwise, exactly who he was and what was owed to a man of his position. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the dark garden. "Yes," he said finally, "they usually do." Something in his voice made her look at him again. There was a tiredness there she recognized, though she could not have said from where. Perhaps it was the same tiredness she felt every time her aunt introduced her to another family friend with a son of marrying age, another transaction dressed up as a conversation. "Aliner," she said, "Whitfield." He turned to her, and for a moment he looked almost startled, as if she had handed him something valuable without warning. "Gideon," he said, "though I am told I am meant to introduce myself as the Duke of Ashcombe. I already knew who you were. Everyone in that room knew who you were." "Yes, that is rather the trouble with a title. It arrives in the room before I do." Aliner almost smiled again. She caught herself before it fully formed, remembering where she was and who he was and how little good could come from smiling at a duke on a cold terrace while her aunt searched the ballroom for her. "I should go back inside," she said. "My aunt will worry." "Will she?" "She will pretend to worry. Mostly she will be angry that I disappeared during the 1 hour that mattered most. The hour when eligible men are meant to notice eligible women." "Something like that." He studied her for a long moment, and there was nothing improper in the way he looked at her, nothing that made her want to step back or cross her arms. It was simply attention, direct and unhurried, the kind she was not used to receiving from anyone. "Then I suppose I should let you return," he said, "before I ruin your evening a second time." "You did not ruin it the first time. The tray did that." "I was standing rather close to the tray." "You were standing rather close to a great many things tonight, Your Grace. I am sure the tray was simply unlucky." It was the closest thing to teasing she had allowed herself all evening, and she saw it land, saw something shift behind his eyes, surprise giving way to something warmer. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and there was a formality in it that did not match the small smile pulling at his mouth. "I have a feeling you are about to become the most interesting part of my season." "I have a feeling you say that to every woman who spills champagne on your shoes." "I have never once said it before tonight." She did not know what to do with that, so she simply turned and walked back toward the terrace doors, aware of his eyes on her the entire way, aware in a manner she did not want to examine too closely of how her heart had not slowed down since the moment the glass hit the floor. Inside, her aunt found her within minutes, gripping her arm with far less gentleness than the Duke had. "Where have you been?" her aunt hissed, dragging her toward a quieter corner of the room. "Do you have any idea who was asking about you not 5 minutes ago?" "I know exactly who," Aliner said. And something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because her aunt's eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp interest. "You spoke to him." "Briefly." "Eleanor," her aunt's grip tightened. "Do you understand what this could mean for us, for your father's name, for every bill sitting unpaid in that house?" "I understand it perfectly," Eleanor said quietly. "That is exactly why I am not going to pretend to be something I am not just to catch his attention." "You do not need to pretend anything," her aunt snapped. "You simply need to be agreeable." Eleanor said nothing to that, because there was nothing safe to say. She let her aunt lead her back into the crowd, back into the noise and the light and the careful performance of a girl hopping to be chosen, and she told herself that whatever had happened on that terrace was nothing more than a strange, small kindness between strangers. It would not be repeated. It could not be, not with everything standing between a vicar's daughter and a duke's world. But across the room, near the tall windows, Gideon Ashcombe stood with a glass of wine he had not touched, watching a girl in a plain blue dress laugh at something one of her friends had said, and found that he could not stop looking. He had spent 11 seasons in ballrooms exactly like this one, surrounded by 100 women who wanted nothing more than his name and the life it promised, and not one of them had ever told him to let go of her arm. Not one of them had ever made him feel, for even 5 minutes, like an ordinary man standing on a cold terrace, rather than a title people were afraid to disappoint. He set his glass down, untouched, and for the first time all evening he smiled without meaning to. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Whitfield felt the weight of his gaze without turning to confirm it, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing at all. She was wrong, though she would not admit it to herself for several weeks yet, and by then it would already be far too late to pretend otherwise. Behind her, near the refreshment table, Lady Priscilla Vane watched the entire exchange with the sharp, careful attention of a woman who intended to be the next Duchess of Ashcombe, and who did not appreciate discovering a rival where she had expected only servants and spilled champagne. She would remember the girl in the plain blue dress. She would remember her very well. 3 days later, a footman arrived at the Whitfield house carrying a small crate of oranges, a note attached in handwriting Eleanor did not recognize, and her aunt nearly fainted from excitement before the door had even fully closed. "Oranges," her aunt breathed, holding the note like it was made of gold. "From the Duke of Ashcombe. Eleanor, do you understand what this means?" "It means he has an excellent gardener," Eleanor said, taking the note from her aunt's hands before it could be read aloud to the entire street. The note itself was short. It said only that he had heard, through some mutual acquaintance she suspected did not exist, that Miss Whitfield was fond of oranges, and that he hoped the cut on her hand had healed well. It was signed simply Gideon. Not the Duke of Ashcombe, just Gideon, as if they were already something close to friends. She did not write back. She told herself this was the correct and sensible response, the response of a young woman who had no intention of encouraging a man so far above her that any hope in that direction was simply foolishness dressed up as romance. Her aunt disagreed loudly and often over the following week, but Eleanor held firm, right up until the moment she saw him again at the Ashworth dinner party and discovered that not writing back had done nothing at all to discourage him. "Miss Whitfield," he said, appearing at her elbow just as the guests were being seated, as though he had been waiting for the exact moment she arrived. "I was beginning to think you had emigrated." "I have been quite occupied," she said, which was not entirely a lie. Occupied with unpaid bills. Occupied with a garden at home that needed more attention than she could give it. Occupied with the growing, uncomfortable awareness that a duke's note sat folded in the drawer of her writing desk, read more times than she would ever admit. "Occupied," he repeated, as if testing the word for hidden meaning. "Not avoiding me, then?" "Why would I avoid you, Your Grace?" "I have no idea, which is precisely why I keep asking." She was seated, to her mild horror, directly across from him at dinner, a seating arrangement she suspected owed nothing to chance and everything to a hostess eager to please a duke known for attending very few dinners at all. Conversation around the table moved through the usual subjects: the weather, a recent horse race, a scandal involving someone's cousin that everyone discussed with far more relish than the facts deserved. It was during a lull in the conversation that the Duke, apparently determined to impress the table, began quoting a line of Latin he attributed to a famous general, something about fortune favoring the bold. "That is not quite right," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. The table went quiet, several forks paused midair. "I beg your pardon," the Duke said, not unkindly, but with the particular surprise of a man who was rarely corrected at his own dinner engagements. "The phrase," Eleanor said, feeling her face grow warm but pressing forward anyway. "It is usually attributed differently, and the ending is not quite what you said. My father was a great reader of the classics. I heard that phrase misquoted at least a dozen times a year growing up." A woman 2 seats down laughed behind her napkin. The Duke, to Eleanor's surprise, did not look embarrassed. He looked delighted. "Well," he said, setting down his glass, "it seems I have found the one person in London willing to correct me in front of an audience. Please, Miss Whitfield, do go on. I would rather be right and humbled than wrong and comfortable. I would not want to embarrass your grace further." "Too late for that. The damage is done. You might as well finish it properly." So she did, quoting the phrase correctly, adding a small note about its original context that she had not meant to share but which came tumbling out anyway, the way facts always did when she was nervous and trying to cover it with confidence. When she finished, several guests were watching her with new interest, and the Duke was watching her with something closer to open admiration. "Remarkable," he said. "I have been quoting that line wrong for a decade. Not once has anyone corrected me. Perhaps no one wanted to risk offending you. And you did not consider that risk." "I considered it," Eleanor said. "I decided accuracy mattered more." He laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and the sound of it turned more heads at the table than the Latin correction had. Across the room, Lady Priscilla Vane watched with a smile fixed carefully in place, though her eyes had gone flat and cold in a way that Eleanor, absorbed entirely in her small victory, did not notice at all. The evening continued, and somewhere between the second course and the dessert, the Duke launched into a long story about a hunting trip in Scotland, full of detail about weather patterns and the particular stubbornness of a horse named Cassius. And Eleanor, exhausted from a week of worry over household expenses and a poor night's sleep the evening before, found her eyelids growing heavy despite her best efforts. She woke with a small start to find the table's attention had shifted, and the Duke had stopped speaking entirely, watching her with an expression somewhere between amusement and something gentler underneath it. "I apologize," she said quickly, sitting up straighter. "I did not mean to fall asleep during your story." "You did not fall asleep during my story," he said. "You fell asleep because my story was, by any reasonable measure, extremely tedious. I have bored a woman unconscious at my own dinner table. This is a new personal achievement." The table laughed, this time with him rather than at either of them, and Eleanor felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. Grateful he had turned an embarrassing moment into something harmless instead of letting it sting. "In my defense," she said, "Cassius sounds like a truly unpleasant horse." He is. I sold him to a man I do not particularly like." "That seems fair to everyone involved." Later, as the guests began to drift toward the drawing room for cards and quiet conversation, the Duke found a moment to walk beside her, close enough to speak without being overheard. "You did not answer my note," he said. "I did not think it required an answer." "It required a great many things, Miss Whitfield. Chief among them, some acknowledgement that a man does not send oranges to a woman he has met for 5 minutes on a terrace, unless he intends something by it." "And what do you intend, your grace?" He was quiet for a moment, longer than the question seemed to require, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its playful edge. "I intend to find out why you are the only woman in London who has not once asked me a single question about my income, my estate, or my prospects." Alina considered this carefully before answering, "Perhaps because none of those things interest me." "Nothing about a duke interests you?" "Not the duke part, no." "Then what does interest you?" She thought of her garden at home, the small orange tree she had been nursing through a difficult winter, the quiet satisfaction of watching something grow despite every reason it should not. She thought of her father's books, still stacked in his study, untouched since his death because she could not bear to move them and could not bear to read them either. "Very little of what happens in rooms like this one," she admitted. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, some careful wall lowering itself if only slightly. "My brother used to say something very similar," he said, "about rooms like this one." It was the first time he had mentioned a brother, and something in the way he said it, quiet and clipped, told Alina not to ask further. She recognized the tone. It was the same tone she used whenever anyone asked about her father, a tone that closed a door before anyone could see what was on the other side of it. "He sounds like he had good judgment," she said carefully. "He did," the Duke said, and then, as though catching himself saying too much, he straightened and offered her a small, polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Shall we join the others before your aunt decides I have kidnapped you?" "That would be a very short kidnapping. I am standing right here in full view of 40 guests." "Then perhaps I have simply monopolized your evening instead. A lesser crime, but I imagine your aunt will still have opinions about it." Her aunt did, in fact, have a great many opinions about it, delivered at length during the carriage ride home. Opinions that ranged from cautious optimism to outright scheming about which gown Alina should wear to the next event where the Duke was likely to appear. Alina listened with half her attention, the other half turning over the strange, brief mention of a brother. The way the Duke's easy charm had cracked open for just a moment to reveal something underneath it that looked very much like grief carefully managed and rarely shown. She told herself it was not her concern. She told herself, several more times over the following days, that whatever loneliness lived behind a Duke's confident smile was not a burden she needed to carry, especially not when her own family's troubles required every ounce of care she had left to give. But when another note arrived the following week, this one accompanying a small book of poetry rather than oranges, she found herself writing back before she had fully decided to. It was a short reply. It thanked him for the book. It mentioned briefly that her father had owned the same edition, and that she had not expected to receive it as a gift from anyone, least of all a duke she had scolded over Latin at a dinner party. She did not mention the brother. She did not ask about him, but she folded the note carefully before sealing it, and some quiet part of her hoped he would understand that she had noticed, and that noticing, in its own small way, was the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. Across town, in a townhouse far grander than the Whitfield home, Gideon Ashcombe read her reply twice before setting it down on his desk, next to a small portrait of a young man with his same dark eyes. A portrait he kept turned toward the wall on most days because looking at it too directly still cost him more than he liked to admit. He turned the portrait slightly, just enough to see it properly, and allowed himself, for the first time in 2 years, to sit with the memory instead of running from it. Somewhere in that quiet moment, without fully understanding why, he decided that Alina Whitfield was going to matter to him in ways the other 100 women currently competing for his attention never would. He did not yet know how right he was, nor how much it would cost them both before the season ended. The storm arrived without warning, the way storms in early autumn often did, turning a pleasant country house gathering into a house full of restless guests trapped indoors for 3 days instead of 1. Lord and Lady Ashworth's estate had plenty of rooms for cards and conversation, but by the second evening, most of the guests had exhausted their patience for both, and the halls had grown quiet with the particular boredom of people who had nowhere else to go. Alina found the greenhouse by accident, following a corridor she did not recognize in search of somewhere quiet to sit away from her aunt's endless commentary on the eligible men currently trapped in the house with them. The glass room sat at the far end of the east wing, warm and humid compared to the rest of the house, filled with rows of plants she recognized, and several she did not. In the corner, half hidden behind a row of ferns, sat a small orange tree, its leaves curling and yellow at the edges, clearly struggling against whatever care it had been given. She knelt beside it without thinking, the way she had knelt beside her own dying tree at home a dozen times before, checking the soil, testing the leaves between her fingers, murmuring the same small assessments she made every time she found something living that needed help and had not yet received it. "You have found my one failure," a voice said from the doorway, and she nearly knocked over a pot in surprise. The Duke stood there, out of his usual formal dress, sleeves rolled up as if he had been doing something useful with his hands before the rain drove him inside as well. He looked younger like this, less like a portrait and more like an actual person standing in a doorway. "This tree is not a failure," Alina said. "It is simply thirsty and confused about the light. Someone has moved it recently, I think. The leaves are stressed from a change in position, not neglect. You can tell that from looking at it. I have kept a garden my whole life. It is the one thing I understand better than almost anything else." He crossed the room and crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell rain and something faintly like cedar on his clothes. "Teach me, then. What does it need?" "Water first, not too much, and move it closer to that window, away from the draft coming from the door." He did as she instructed without question, lifting the pot with more care than she expected from a man who likely had servants for every task requiring physical effort. When he set it down near the window, he looked at her for approval like a boy waiting to be told he had done something right, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of it. "There," she said softly, "now we wait." "I am not very good at waiting." "Most people are not. It is not a skill anyone teaches you." He settled onto an overturned crate near the tree, watching her work with quiet attention as she found a small watering can among the tools along the wall and gave the soil exactly as much moisture as it needed, no more. "You said your father read the classics," he said after a moment. "Is that where the garden came from as well?" "No, my mother kept a garden before she died. I was very young, but I remember her hands more than her face, if that makes sense. The way she would press soil around a seedling like she was tucking it into bed." "That makes perfect sense." "After she died, my father tried to keep it going for a while, out of some sense of duty, I think. He was not very good at it. Too many books, not enough patience for dirt. Eventually I took it over, mostly because I could not bear to watch it die a second time." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the greenhouse glass. "My brother liked gardens too," he said finally. "Not for the plants themselves. He liked that nobody expected anything from him out here. No title, no expectations, just dirt and quiet." Alina did not push. She had learned over the past weeks that pushing only closed doors that patients sometimes opened on their own. "Edmund," the Duke said, and it was the first time she had heard the name. "That was his name. He died 2 years ago. A fever, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could have prevented, which somehow made it worse rather than easier. I have not said his name out loud in longer than I would like to admit." "You just said it now." "Yes," he said, looking at her with something raw and unguarded in his expression. "I did." She reached over without fully deciding to and rested her hand briefly over his where it sat on his knee. She did not say anything comforting. She did not tell him it would be all right, or that time healed all wounds, or any of the small, useless phrases people used when they did not know what else to offer. She simply let her hand rest there, warm and steady, and let the silence hold whatever needed holding. "Thank you," he said eventually, "for not saying anything. There is nothing helpful to say. I have learned that from my own losses. People mean well, but words rarely fix anything. Sometimes quiet is the only honest response." They stayed like that for a while, the rain drumming steadily against the glass roof above them, the small orange tree slowly drinking in the water she had given it. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier weight. "I have told 100 women about my income this season," he said. "I have discussed my estate, my horses, my plans for the next harvest. I have never once told any of them my brother's name. Perhaps they never asked the right questions. Perhaps I never wanted them to." Alina looked at him properly then, at the tired lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with a poor night's sleep, at the careful way he held himself even now, even relaxed, like a man permanently bracing for something. She understood that particular exhaustion. She had worn it herself since the day her father died, and left her holding together a household with nothing but stubbornness and an increasingly small amount of money. "My father died owing more than he ever let on," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "I found out after the funeral, going through his papers. He spent years pretending everything was fine because he could not bear for anyone, especially me, to worry. And now you are the one pretending. Someone has to hold the household together. My aunt does her best, but she is better at hoping things will work out than actually making them work out." "That sounds exhausting." "It is, but it is also mine to carry, and I would rather carry it honestly than pretend the way my father did." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of quiet respect she had not seen from him before, not the polite admiration of a man impressed by wit at a dinner table, but something deeper, something that recognized itself in another person. "I would like to help," he said carefully, "not as a duke offering charity, as someone who understands what it costs to carry something alone." "I do not need charity, Your Grace." "I did not say charity. I said help. There is a difference, though I understand why the distinction might feel thin from where you are standing." Alina considered this, turning the watering can over in her hands, feeling the weight of an offer that could change everything, and could also, if handled poorly, cost her the last shred of pride she had managed to hold onto through 2 years of quiet financial ruin. "Let me think on it," she said finally. "That is all I ask." The rain continued outside, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to sit in the warm, humid quiet of the greenhouse, surrounded by growing things that needed patience rather than grand gestures. Alina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply present in a moment rather than worrying about the one that would follow it. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Anything." "Why me? There are 100 women this season who would give anything to sit where I am sitting right now. Women with better connections, better dowries, better manners at dinner parties. Why does any of this interest you?" He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things she asked him, without the practiced charm he offered so easily to everyone else. "Because you told me to let go of your arm," he said. "Because you fell asleep during my story about a horse I did not even particularly like. Because you corrected my Latin in front of 40 guests without a single moment of hesitation. And because right now, sitting in a greenhouse in the middle of a rainstorm, you are the only person who has asked me a question about my brother instead of my income. Those seem like very small reasons to choose someone." "They are the only reasons that have ever mattered to me," he said. "Everything else is just noise other people mistake for substance." Alina did not have a response to that. She simply sat with it, letting the words settle somewhere she suspected she would return to later, in quieter moments, when the noise of the season pressed back in around her. Outside, the rain began to ease, the first break in 3 days of steady gray weather, and somewhere down the long corridor, she could hear her aunt's voice calling her name with increasing urgency, likely having noticed her absence and assumed the worst, or possibly the best, depending on how one measured such things. "I should go," she said, rising from the floor and brushing soil from her skirt. "Alina," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the title attached, and something about hearing it in his voice made her pause at the doorway. "Thank you for the tree, for staying." "Take care of it," she said, nodding toward the small orange tree now sitting properly in the light. It only needed someone to notice what it actually required, instead of what everyone assumed it needed. She left him there in the warm quiet of the greenhouse, and if she had turned back before the door closed fully behind her, she would have seen him sitting beside the small tree for a long while afterward, watching the last of the rain streak down the glass, thinking not about income or estates or the 100 women waiting for his attention, but about a vicar's daughter with dirt under her fingernails who had somehow, without meaning to, become the only person in London he trusted with the truth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, plain and unsigned, and it undid 3 weeks of careful, quiet hope in the space of 4 sentences. Alina read it twice at the breakfast table before she fully understood what it was saying. A solicitor, acting on behalf of an unnamed benefactor, had arranged to settle her family's outstanding debts in full. The letter used careful, formal language, the kind meant to soften a blow rather than deliver good news, and by the time she reached the final line, her hands had gone cold around the paper. "Who sent this?" she said to her aunt, though she already suspected the answer before the words left her mouth. Her aunt, to her credit, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I do not know the details," she said, which Alina recognized immediately as a lie, the same careful evasion her aunt used whenever she had done something she suspected would not be well received. "Aunt Margaret." "He asked me not to say anything until it was settled," her aunt admitted finally, setting down her teacup with a clatter that betrayed more nerves than she wanted to show. "The Duke. He came to me privately, weeks ago now, and asked about our situation. I did not think there was any harm in answering honestly. He seemed genuinely concerned, Alina, not the way men usually pretend concern to get what they want." "You told him about the debts, about everything?" "I told him what any reasonable person would want to know before considering a serious match." "This was not his to fix," Alina said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that her aunt flinched slightly. "This was not his business, and it was certainly not yours to hand over without asking me first. I was trying to help. You were trying to secure a duke for me, which is not the same thing as helping, no matter how you dress it up." Alina left the table without finishing her tea, the letter still clutched in her hand, and did not stop moving until she reached her room and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, staring at the careful, formal handwriting, feeling something twist painfully in her chest that she could not immediately name. It should have felt like relief. The debts that had haunted her for 2 years, the ones she had carried quietly and alone, pretending to her aunt and to herself that everything would eventually work itself out, were simply gone, settled by a stroke of someone else's pen. She should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt exposed, as though every private shame she had carefully hidden behind polite conversation and careful budgeting had been laid bare in front of a man she had only known for a matter of weeks. He had not asked her. That was the part that would not stop circling in her mind, sharp and insistent. He had gone to her aunt instead, had learned the details of her family's ruin secondhand, and had acted on it without once giving Alina the chance to decide for herself whether she wanted his help, his money, or his involvement in a burden she had spent 2 years learning to carry alone. She thought of the greenhouse. She thought of the way she had told him about her father, about the quiet dignity of carrying something honestly rather than pretending it did not exist. She had trusted him with that, and in response, he had taken the very thing she had been most careful to protect, her privacy, her pride, the last piece of control she had over her own circumstances, and handed it over to a solicitor as though it were nothing more than a problem requiring a signature. By the time the Duke arrived at the house that evening, having heard through some channel that the letter had reached her, Alina had rehearsed exactly what she intended to say, and none of it was gentle. "You had no right," she said, before he had even fully crossed the threshold of the drawing room, before her aunt could offer him tea or usher him toward a comfortable chair. He stopped, clearly having expected gratitude rather than anger, and something in his expression shifted from hopeful to confused. "Alina, I only wanted to help. You told me yourself how much the debts weighed on you. I told you that in confidence, in a greenhouse during a storm, because for one evening I thought I had found someone who understood what it meant to carry something difficult without turning it into a transaction. Instead, you went behind my back to my aunt, discussed my family's finances like a business arrangement, and settled it without a single word to me until it was already done. I did not think you would agree to it if I asked directly. You are far too proud for your own good, and I did not want your pride to stand between your family and actual relief. That was not your decision to make. Someone needed to make it. You were drowning, Alina, quietly and stubbornly, and I could not simply watch that happen when I had the means to stop it. So you decided, without me, that my dignity was less important than your comfort in fixing something that was mine to fix." The words landed exactly as sharply as she intended, and she watched something in his face close off, the openness she had grown used to over the past weeks retreating behind a colder, more guarded expression she recognized from that very first night at the ball. "I did not do this for my comfort," he said, his voice low and tight. "I did this because I care what happens to you, more than I have cared about anything in longer than I want to admit, and watching you suffer quietly while pretending everything was fine was not something I was willing to simply observe from a safe distance. Caring about someone means asking them what they need. It does not mean deciding for them and calling it kindness. Then tell me what I should have done differently, because from where I stood, every path led to the same outcome, you struggling in silence rather than accepting help that was freely offered." "You should have asked," she said, her voice finally breaking slightly, revealing more than she wanted him to see. "You should have trusted me enough to make my own choice, even if that choice meant continuing to struggle. Instead, you decided my struggle was something to be managed rather than respected." The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that pressed uncomfortably against the walls, and her aunt, sensing the depth of what was unfolding, quietly excused herself and left them alone, though Alina barely registered her leaving. "I am sorry," the Duke said finally, though the words came out stiff, more an acknowledgement of her anger than a genuine understanding of why it existed. "I did not intend to make you feel smaller. I intended the opposite. Intentions rarely matter as much as we would like them to, Your Grace." The formal title landed between them like a slap, and she saw him absorb it, saw the careful distance it created settle over his features. Whatever had grown between them in the greenhouse, whatever fragile trust had built itself in stolen moments across dinner parties and quiet conversations, felt, in that moment, dangerously close to collapsing entirely. "I will not apologize for wanting to help you," he said finally, his voice regaining some of its earlier coldness. "But I understand now that I went about it in a way that cost you something I did not fully appreciate until this moment. I am sorry for that. That is not the same as understanding why it was wrong." "Perhaps not, but it is what I have to offer tonight." Alina said nothing further, and after a long, strained moment, the Duke turned and left the house without another word, without the careful warmth that had characterized every previous departure, and Alina stood alone in the drawing room listening to the front door close with a quiet, final sound that felt far heavier than it should have. Her aunt found her there several minutes later, still standing in the same spot, staring at nothing in particular. "You have ruined it," her aunt said, though there was less anger in her voice than exhaustion. "Do you understand what you have thrown away tonight?" "I have not thrown anything away. I have simply refused to be managed like a problem requiring a solution." He offered you everything, Alina: security, a title, an end to every worry that has kept you awake at night for 2 years. He offered me all of that without once asking whether I wanted it delivered that way. There is a difference between generosity and control, Aunt Margaret, even when they wear the same coat. Her aunt did not have an answer for that, and the two of them sat in uncomfortable silence for the rest of the evening, the settled debts sitting on the table between them like a strange, unwelcome gift neither of them fully knew how to hold. That night, alone in her room, Alina allowed herself, for just a few minutes, to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the anger, which had carried her through the confrontation itself, but the quieter grief underneath it, the recognition that she had wanted, more than she had let herself admit even to herself, for this particular version of hope to survive. She thought of the small orange tree in the greenhouse, thriving now under careful, patient attention. She thought of a name spoken out loud for the first time in 2 years, and a hand resting quietly over another without needing to fill the silence with empty comfort. She thought of all of it, and let herself grieve the possibility that it might already be over, before finally allowing herself, well past midnight, to fall into an exhausted and uneasy sleep. Across town, Gideon Ashcombe sat alone in his study, the small portrait of his brother turned fully toward the room now rather than hidden against the wall, and stared at it for a long while without truly seeing it, replaying every word of the conversation that had just ended so badly, searching for the exact moment he had mistaken control for care, and finding, to his growing discomfort, that he could not locate a single point where he would have chosen differently, even now. Even knowing how badly it had wounded her. He understood, somewhere beneath the wounded pride and frustration, that this was precisely the problem. He had spent his entire life solving things for people, arranging outcomes from a comfortable distance, and had never once considered that the people he was trying to help might want something other than the outcome itself. It was well past midnight before he finally extinguished the last candle in his study, no closer to a solution than he had been 3 hours earlier, carrying instead a new and unfamiliar weight, the fear that he had finally found the one woman who saw him clearly, and had lost her within a matter of weeks by making the same mistake that had cost him every honest relationship in his life before this one. 3 weeks passed without a single note, without a single oranges crate, without so much as a glimpse of the Duke of Ashcombe at any of the dinners, balls, or garden parties that made up the remainder of the season. Alina told herself this was for the best. She told herself this while staring at her father's books, still stacked untouched in his study. She told herself this while tending to her own small orange tree at home, now finally showing new growth after months of careful attention. She told herself this so often that she nearly believed it, right up until the evening her aunt returned from a friend's house with news that made her drop the teacup she had been holding. "He is announcing his engagement," her aunt said, breathless from the walk and the excitement of gossip freshly gathered. "Tonight, at his own ball, Lady Priscilla Vane, of all people, has been telling anyone who will listen for the past week that it is already arranged." Alina set down the broken pieces of the teacup with hands that had gone strangely steady, the way hands sometimes did when a person had already absorbed the worst news they expected to receive and found there was simply nothing left to shake. "That is good news for him," she said, and was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "I hope they are very happy." "Alina." "I mean it, Aunt Margaret. It was never going to be me. I made certain of that myself 3 weeks ago in this very drawing room." Her aunt looked at her for a long moment, something softer than usual in her expression. "You do not have to pretend with me, not tonight." Alina did not answer that. She simply excused herself to her room, where she sat by the window for the rest of the evening, watching the sky darken over rooftops she had memorized without meaning to, and did not allow herself to cry, though the effort of not crying cost her considerably more than crying would have. Across town, at the very ball her aunt had described, the evening was unfolding rather differently than Lady Priscilla Vane had spent the past week promising her acquaintances it would. The ballroom of Ashcombe House glittered with more candles than Alina's entire street used in a month, and every eligible woman in London stood among the crowd, dressed in her finest, waiting for the moment the Duke would finally make his long-anticipated announcement. Lady Priscilla stood near the front of the room, a triumphant smile fixed carefully in place, certain that within the hour her name would be spoken alongside his for the rest of the evening and the rest of her life. The Duke climbed the small platform at the head of the room where announcements were traditionally made, and the crowd fell into an expectant hush, glasses lowered, conversations paused mid-sentence. "I understand," he began, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "that most of you are here tonight expecting a particular kind of announcement." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Lady Priscilla's smile widened. "I have spent 11 seasons in rooms exactly like this one," he continued, "surrounded by 100 women, each one perfectly capable, perfectly accomplished, each one taught from birth to want precisely what I represent rather than who I actually am underneath the title. I do not say this unkindly. It is simply the truth of how this particular world operates, and I have played my part in it as willingly as anyone." The room had gone very quiet now, uncertain where this was heading, the earlier excitement curdling slowly into confusion. "Somewhere in the middle of this season," he went on, "I met a woman who told me to let go of her arm the very first time we spoke. She fell asleep during one of my stories. She corrected my Latin in front of 40 guests without a moment's hesitation. And she was, without question, the only person in this entire city who ever asked me a single question about my brother instead of my income." Lady Priscilla's smile had frozen entirely now, understanding beginning to dawn across her features, along with a rising heat of humiliation. "I made a mistake with her," the Duke continued, his voice steady despite the visible tension gathering in the room. "I tried to solve her problems instead of trusting her to solve them herself, and in doing so, I very nearly lost the only genuine thing that has happened to me in 11 years of exactly this kind of room. I do not have an announcement of engagement to offer any of you tonight, and I apologize for whatever expectations were built around that idea. What I have instead is an apology I owe elsewhere, and I intend to deliver it properly before this evening ends." He stepped down from the platform amid a rising wave of whispers, ignoring the stunned faces turned toward him, ignoring Lady Priscilla's furious retreat toward the refreshment table, and walked directly out of his own ballroom without a backward glance, calling for his carriage before he had even fully crossed the entrance hall. Alina was still sitting by her window, watching the last light fade from the sky, when she heard the carriage arrive outside, followed almost immediately by an urgent knock at the front door. Her aunt reached it before she did, and by the time Alina made her way down the stairs, the Duke was already standing in the entrance hall, still dressed for his own ball, looking considerably less composed than she had ever seen him. "You are supposed to be announcing your engagement," she said, stopping several steps above him, needing the distance for reasons she did not fully examine. "I was supposed to do a great many things tonight," he said. "I have decided instead to do the one thing that actually matters." "Which is?" "Apologize properly. Not the stiff apology I offered 3 weeks ago, the one that acknowledged your anger without truly understanding it. I have spent these 3 weeks thinking of nothing else, Alina, and I understand now what I could not see then. You did not need me to fix your circumstances. You needed me to trust that you were capable of fixing them yourself, or of choosing not to, and either way, that choice belonged to you alone. That is a fairly complete understanding for 3 weeks of silence. It cost me considerably more than 3 weeks of silence to arrive at it. It cost me the version of myself who believed that caring for someone meant controlling the outcome of their life. I do not want to be that man anymore, particularly not with you. Alina came down the remaining steps slowly, studying him carefully, searching his face for the particular kind of performance she had grown used to seeing from men who wanted something, and were willing to say whatever necessary to get it. She did not find it. What she found instead was the same tired honesty she had seen in the greenhouse, stripped now of any polish or careful charm. Simply a man standing in her entrance hall, asking to be given another chance without any guarantee that he deserved one. "I am not interested in being managed," she said quietly. "Not now, not ever. If this is going to be something, it has to be built on being asked rather than decided for. I understand that now. I did not fully understand it 3 weeks ago, and I am sorry it took losing you to learn it properly." "You have not lost me," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "You very nearly did. But standing here in your own clothes rather than a duke's armor, asking rather than announcing, I find I am not quite as unreachable as I would like to pretend." Something in his expression shifted, hope breaking carefully through the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks, though he did not move toward her, seeming to understand instinctively that this moment required patience rather than a grand gesture. "What would you like me to do?" he asked. "Truly, not what I assume you need, what you are actually asking for." Alina considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, weighing it against everything she had learned about herself and about him over the strange, difficult weeks of this particular season. "I would like you to ask me things," she said finally, "about my garden, about my father's books which I still have not been able to open since he died, about what I actually want from my life, rather than what a duke's attention is assumed to solve. I would like to be asked consistently, rather than decided for, even when the deciding comes wrapped in kindness." "I can do that," he said. "I would like very much to do that for as long as you will allow it." "That is not a proposal, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the tension in his face. "It is not. I have learned, rather expensively, not to rush toward outcomes before the person involved has had a proper chance to choose them herself." Alina felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had been carrying since the moment her aunt announced his engagement, replaced slowly by something lighter, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like the beginning of an honest thing rather than a careful performance. "You may call again tomorrow," she said, "if you would like to ask me about my garden." "I would like that very much." "And Gideon," she added, using his given name for only the second time since they had met. Watching the effect it had on him, the way his whole posture seemed to soften at the sound of it. "No more solicitors. No more arrangements made behind my back, however good the intention behind them." "No more solicitors," he agreed. "Only questions honestly asked and whatever answers you choose to give me." He left shortly after, this time with a warmth in his departure that had been entirely absent 3 weeks earlier, and Alina stood in her entrance hall for a long while after the door closed, feeling the strange, quiet weight of a season that had nearly ended in disappointment, instead settling, unexpectedly, into something that finally felt like it belonged to her. The following morning, he called precisely as promised, and asked about her garden for nearly an hour, listening with genuine attention as she explained the particular stubbornness of orange trees and the quiet satisfaction of watching something grow despite every reason it had to fail. He did not offer solutions. He did not attempt to fix anything. He simply listened and asked follow-up questions and let her lead the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. It was, Alina realized somewhere in the middle of that ordinary, unremarkable morning, The first time in the entire season that anyone had chosen her simply for being herself, rather than for what she represented, what she could provide, or what problem she might conveniently solve. The 100 women who had wanted the Duke of Ashcombe that season eventually moved on to other prospects, other seasons, other titles waiting to be claimed. Lady Priscilla Vane married a viscount by the following spring and rarely spoke of the incident again, at least not in company where the Duke's name might arise. Eleanor Whitfield married Gideon Ashcombe the following autumn, in a quiet ceremony attended by considerably fewer guests than his engagement announcement would have drawn, in a garden rather than a ballroom, surrounded by the particular kind of growing things that neither of them had ever needed to explain to the other. Her father's books were finally opened, read slowly over the following winter, in a study that eventually held two portraits side by side, a young man with dark eyes turned fully toward the room, and a quiet vicar whose daughter had learned, against every expectation of her season, that being chosen properly required first being seen honestly, and that the seeing in the end mattered considerably more than the choosing itself.